Well, let's do some speed running. We are 11-12. Climbing up. This is the third speed run. And just to remind everybody, we're playing fundamental openings. We're playing E4, E5, D4, D5, and with white, we're playing E4 repertoire, but very, very basic openings to emphasize fundamentals. Okay, let's begin. Let's go E4. All right, so G6. This is the first time that we are encountering this move in the speedrun. We've encountered it many times before, and of course, as you guys know, first we need to play D4. Maybe I should have bishop H6'd him. And in this situation, there's many setups that you can adopt. Many setups that you can adopt with white. But I'm going to teach you guys one that I like to play in Blitz. And it's quite annoying to face because people who play the modern generally are looking for a pretty tactical game. And knight c3 will often lead to those kinds of positions. But you can play an interesting move here. You can play the move c3 with a pawn. And this creates essentially a pawn chain so that the bishop is biting on granite. And the downside of this move is that it deprives the knight of the c3 square. But as I often say, that's not a problem. Later on, the knight can develop to d2. And just like in the London, when you build a little pawn house, you want to put the bishop in that hole, bishop d3. And now you develop normally. And so the only real point of this is that black's bishop is essentially harmless for the time being. Yeah, we can play knight f3 first. It doesn't really matter. Bishop d3, knight f3. Don't put too much weight into like which particular developing move we're making. As long as you try not to develop this knight until the dark squared bishop is out. If possible. That's not always possible, and there's ways of dealing with it if you have to play knight d2 first. Okay, so he goes d5. So we have to determine whether e5 is good for us, and I think it is. There's a couple of reasons for that. He's weakened all these dark squares, and closing up the center is going to give us an easier job of exploiting them. So to me, e5 is basically a no-brainer here. He can play this like in a French. He can play c5, but then we're just going to go knight f3. Okay, so knight f3, let's continue developing. And c5, so he does end up going c5. Now, we don't need to react to that move. We can play d takes c5, that's a possibility, and try to cling to the extra pawn. But I don't really think that's in the spirit of the position. I think we should just continue developing. We don't have to worry about the pressure on the d4 pawn. It's not reached any kind of dangerous levels just yet. Okay, so c4, I think, helps us a lot. He continues to lock up the center, and what's going to eventually happen is that we're going to have basically a blank check to attack on the king side. And why do I say we're going to attack on the king side? Largely because he's got these massive weaknesses on the dark squares, which eventually we are going to try to occupy with possibly this knight. Now, who can tell me what maneuver is necessary in order to get the b1 knight in a position where it can ultimately try to exploit the f6 square? And I propose that we start with a move that may seem mysterious. It looks actually quite bad, which is rook e1, and a lot of you guys are finding it. And the point is to vacate the f1 square for the knight. What we're going to do is go knight bd2, knight f1, and then either knight e3, knight g4, or even knight g3 with a potential sacrifice on h5, which sometimes happens. If you think about this bishop, you can kind of put together the dots. And we also could play bishop g5, but that's not mandatory. We're not worried about him pushing his f-pawn, so let's just continue with the general plan. Knight f1, knight e3, knight g4, and then we're going to try to put that knight on f6. Okay, so a little spanner in the works. Goes knight f5, which is a good move. We can take that knight, but I don't really like that idea. Why give up this bishop? We can go g4 to kick the knight away. But I'll show this after the game. There's the move knight h4 in those kinds of positions, which is quite nasty. So bishop g5 feels very natural here because we're exploiting the drawback of knight f5. We're hitting the queen with tempo, and we're still clamping down on the f6 square. And now the move g4 becomes more possible, although if we put a pawn on g4, we take away that square from the knight. So let's see where he puts his queen, and then we'll decide. Okay, goes f6. And this basically does our work for us, because when this move is played in the wrong types of positions, what's going to happen at the end of the day is that this e5 square is going to be a huge weakness for black. And our job is to occupy that square, preferably with a knight, but not immediately. If we go knight e5 immediately, he takes it, and then the knight has to be replaced with the rook, and the rook's not the best blockader. So we can take different approaches in this position. My favorite approach is to start by trading off black's only active piece, which is the f5 knight, but not with the bishop. I still like this bishop. I want to give it away. So what move am I thinking of? Which is still in accordance with our general plan. We can also play queen d2 here, very flexible. Move knight e3 or knight g3. I like knight e3 because we're also aiming for g4 once again. And if black ignores us, we can play knight g4, knight e5, which is exactly what's going to happen. Knight g4. This is not worrisome. The pawn on c3 is safe. And another thing to remember, when you've got this kind of situation with full control over a square, you don't need to rush. I see this very often. You don't need to rush to put a piece there. Right? There's nobody's going to do anything with that e5 square. So what I like is a more flexible approach. So let's connect the rooks first. And maybe on the next move, we'll put a knight on e5. But sometimes the threat is stronger than the execution here. So we connect our rooks. Maybe we'll double in the e file. And such positions are generally not... You can't win them very fast. You have to be very patient. Okay, so he's basically forcing us to go knight e5. I will oblige. And of course, we take on e5 with a knight. Yeah, this pawn is like... In general, black's pawn structure is just horrific. We can also put a queen on g5. Okay, but in general, I propose a slow approach here where we improve our position methodically and slowly and not... we don't do anything drastic. Even queen g5 I don't like as much because black can go queen f6 in response and offer a queen trade, and I want to keep the queens on the board in this position. So what's the go-to plan when in such positions is to double the rooks on the e-file. But before we even do that, there is a potentially worrisome source of counterplay, which is the move g5. But it doesn't really work, and if he goes g5, I'll show you guys why. In general, if you're playing these kinds of positions with black, you have to try to get some form of activity, whether it's on the king side or in the center. I mean, if you just sit around passively and let your opponent destroy you, you're not going to last very long. Okay, so in this position, I think it's a great idea to prevent g5. Why is g5 dangerous? Because if we let black unfold his pieces on the king side, you can go g5, h4, and then this bishop from e8 can activate on h5. So why allow the king side expansion? So the move that comes to mind is either h4 or f4. But f4 is a little bit weakening. f4 cuts off the diagonal for the queen, so let's go h4, and then we can go g3. You often see this pawn arrangement on the king side. Knight g4. In general, as I said, we want to keep a knight on e5. So generally speaking, a trade wouldn't be good, but if you just look at this position concretely, you can see that we're just transforming our advantage. Our knight did its job on e5. Now we take on g4, and we can simply take this pawn on e6. And now we're up a pawn, and we still have this monster e5 square. And bishop d7, and this will often happen, just total collapse. Don't automatically move your rook back. Just marinate on this position for a second. Don't forget about your bishop on c2. There's a reason we kept it on the board. And the reason is rook takes g6, and he resigns before we get a chance to play it. Okay, that was a nice positional game. Simple, but nice. Okay. Time for some analysis. So, yeah, this is called the modern defense. It's closely related to the perk, which is e4, d6. And these openings often transpose into each other. In the perk, black plays knight f6 and then g6. So in the modern, black delays the development of the g8 knight for many reasons. Sometimes the knight goes to e7, as it did here. And sometimes black waits for the most opportune moment to go knight f6. So d4, bishop g7, and now the move c3, which is far from the most popular. And most people develop one of the knights here, knight c3 or knight f3. And in previous speedruns, we've played knight c3, which is sort of the classical approach. I like knight c3 more than knight f3 because this allows you to play the Austrian attack, and the Austrian attack is the move f4, often considered sort of the most principled way of meeting the perk and the modern. Not necessarily the best, but the most ambitious. And you can also play f3 in these positions and go for an English attack setup with bishop e3. And in a sense, we're doing the same thing on the other side of the board, which is, of course, a lot more positional. We go c3. blunting the bishop, and then bishop d3. So generally, of course, black does not play e6. Black plays d6 and gets into a perk. And I play this line very frequently in over-the-board blitz against strong opponents. Thank you, Curious, for the 5 gifted. Gata Kamsky is also well known for liking the setup with white. And basically, this bishop goes to g5, then the knight goes to d2, and you're playing against the g7 bishop. If black is accurate, thank you, Curious, again. If black is accurate, this is not the most dangerous system, but it's easy to play and it's easy to understand. He plays e6, which is like, I don't remember what is this setup called? Is that the hippo? When black goes like knight e7, knight d7, and then double fianchetto. I never remember what it's called. I think it's the hippo, yeah. So the hippo can be good against certain setups, but here our opponent played some weird mixture of the hippo and the French, which is no good. d5 is a mistake strategically. Yeah, I mean, if you can trade dark squared bishops, that would be awesome because it would oftentimes even further expose the weakness of the dark squares. If black wants to play a hippo, then you should go d6 and then b6, bishop b7, and it's not so bad. It's not so easy to crack the hippo. It's a highly underrated opening, in fact, against many different setups. If white plays the right setup, the hippo, I think, can be shattered pretty quickly. But not necessarily the way that I've played it. Okay, so d5, I hope e5 made sense. Of course, we don't want to trade on d5 here. That just solves all of black's problems. Thank you for the 1,000 bits. Yes, I will. Knight e7. Now we play knight f3. A lot of people in this type of position make a move that I don't really like as much, which is f4. This looks good, right? You're building up your center. First of all, this is unnecessary. It's not like e5. The e5 pawn is a weakness that needs to be defended. Second of all, you're making it harder for yourself to exploit the dark squared weaknesses. Now your bishop can't come out. And, you know, you occupy real estate on the king side. It's going to make it harder for you to maneuver. So f4 is good in positions where you have a realistic shot at playing f5. But here you obviously don't because black is defending this with like 800 pieces. So I think knight f3 is just more reasonable. So c5, castles, and c4 is I think another inaccuracy. Black should probably keep some tension going on the square to at least divide our attention, because the way he played it, we can just divert all of our attention to the king side. Okay. So castles, and now again rook e1. The whole point is to open up this pathway for the knight. And you might be asking, well, I've talked before about the 3-move rule and how to evaluate whether ideas are realistic. Remember that this is a highly closed center, so you have a lot more time. The atoms in the position move a lot more slowly. So you can think of the temperature as being pretty low here. And so you have a lot of time to move your pieces around from side to side. All right, so knight bc6, and now we start the maneuver. Basically, the 3-move rule says, well, it's not a formal rule, but if you have a position with an open or semi-open center, if an idea takes 3 moves or longer, it's likely unrealistic. Like, that's all that it is. And it's got a lot of exceptions. Okay. What should black play if not for f6? Well, black should probably play for queenside pressure, b5, b4. I honestly think black is strategically in huge trouble. So he's already made a lot of mistakes. What about h4 instead of castles, asks Dave. h4 instead. h4 is an interesting approach, but it kind of burns the bridges. Because now if you want to castle kingside, it's not as appetizing. Yeah, in some of these positions, h4 is good, but black can go h6 and create these annoying pawns, where if you go h5, then black goes g5. But I'll tell you when h4 is good. If the f-pawn can move to f4, then sometimes h4 can be good. But for example, in this position, I would consider h4 more heavily, because if black plays h6, there's this typical idea of going h5, creating a weakness on g5, and now hitting it with f4. This is an example of when f4 actually impacts the position, and you start opening up black's king side. So this would be an interesting approach. But if we played knight f3, then it doesn't make as much sense. Okay, so knight f1, knight f5. Now we get our bishop out with tempo. And f6 is maybe even the decisive mistake. I would say that black has to black has to refrain from that move and play like queen b6. But again, this is really bad. We would go queen c1. Yeah, you can go h4. You can move the h-pawn, but not in order to attack, but in order to go knight h2, knight g4, and knight f6. That is another pathway to the f6 square. That is another pathway to the f6 square. So black is strategically busted here. There's very little that black can do. Very little that black can do against kind of dark square infiltration. Yeah, I'm at a loss to say what black can even play here. Maybe the lesser evil is to go queen c7 and try to go b5, b4, but that doesn't even give black anything. Okay, so f6 takes, bishop f6, queen f6, and now knight e3. Our main advantage, of course, is this e5 square, and more broadly, the fact that black has a terrible bishop, a terrible pawn on e6, and we have massive pressure down the e file. b5, knight g4. Well, like I explained, f6 was a mistake because it increases the accessibility to this weak square. It also basically prevents black from ever having any counterplay, because black is never going to be able to go e5. And as long as that's the case, you're basically sitting on black's position permanently. Okay, queen d2. h5 creates even more weaknesses, although, again, the position's already hopeless strategically. And now very patiently just doubling rooks on the e-file. Yeah, white also has zero risk of losing this position. Thank you, Aiden Parker, for the 5 gifted subs. I mentioned earlier that we weren't afraid of the move g5. Who can find a strong response for white in this position? Yeah, I mean, you can play rook e1, but that doesn't really prevent black from continuing to expand. Yeah, knight f3, I think, is a very strong move here. It's a very hard move to find for multiple reasons. It's a knight move backwards, which is already one of the most difficult moves in chess. It also moves the knight away from the outpost, but here we're simply going after black's pawns. We're attacking g5, we're attacking e6, and if black plays g4, then you go knight g5, and the e6 pawn cannot be defended, and black's whole position collapses. And this leads me to an important point, which is that if you have a piece on an outpost, don't assume that it has to stay there for all of eternity. The important thing isn't that we have a knight on e5, it's that we have control of the square. That's also why in isolated queen pawn positions, I always try to emphasize it's less important to put a piece on the blockading square in front of the pawn, but much more important rather to have full control of that square, so you don't have to worry about your opponent playing e5 and freeing himself up. Does rook f5 defend the e-pawn? Yeah, I mean, you can play rook f6, but then you'll lose the g-pawn. But once he played knight h6, now g5 is more of a, well, it's still not really a threat, but this was giving me a headache, so we now have a possibility of just stopping everything. Okay, so knight g4, and of course, again, we are flexible in regards to trading knights because we win the pawn. More resilient would have been bishop f7, but then we would have just parked the rook on e5. h5 is now a threat, and the position is lost. Yeah, this isn't just about a pawn. Black's whole position falls apart instantly as soon as the floodgates open, and black's position is just so riddled with weaknesses it's impossible to hold. g5 is not such a big threat. Again, don't think of things just as threats or not threats, right? When I say a move is unpleasant, it doesn't mean because, oh, you're going to lose your queen on the next move. g5 and h4 opens up some space on the king side, and especially, as I mentioned, if this bishop can come alive through h5, that gives black unnecessary counterplay, and if possible, you want to prevent these things. What was the critical mistake for black? There wasn't one, there were several. I mean, already d5 is a mistake. Then c4 is a mistake because it takes the pressure off of the d4 pawn. And then f6 might be the decisive mistake.